Welcome again to this forum, Liturgy in the Time of the Pandemic. My name is Bob Herto, speaking from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests. Today, our moderator is Father Gilbert Sunghera of the Society of Jesus. Father Gilbert is a associate professor of architecture at the University of Detroit, Mercy. And his area of research is sacred space, use of sacred space, and design of sacred space. I would like to therefore turn it over to Father Sunghera, who will introduce today's panelists and our topic.
Again, my name is Gilbert Sunghera, and I'll be serving just as the moderator for today's panel discussion. And this is a continuation from the first forum that we did last Wednesday. And just to note, you'll be able to, if you weren't part of that first forum, you can go to the webpage and you'll be able to find the recording of that. And hopefully that will provide some bigger background. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I'd like to just go over a few quick ground rules. The current liturgical norms differ in each diocese and by location due to the current spread of the virus in that region. These practices are evolving, so the forum is meant to help inspire ways to fine-tune your own practice. Your local diocesan office of worship is the arbiter of evolving ideas, so we encourage you to work with them. Second, we are not debating the issues of religious liberties or government control of religious practices in this forum. And thirdly, the forum will examine a set of practices collected from different regions and review them in light of public health concerns and the impact they have on current liturgical practices and principles. The innovative spirit is commendable, so do not take these comments as critique of bad planning, but as a way of fine-tuning your own practices. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. The first is Michael Rozier, who is an assistant professor of health management and policy in the College of Public Health and Social Justice at St. Louis University. His undergraduate degree is in chemistry from SLU, a master's in health sciences from Johns Hopkins University, and a Ph.D. from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in health management and policy. His research interests include public health ethics, organizational ethics, community benefits, policy framing, population health strategies, and community hospital partnerships. But these last few months, he probably has had his greatest challenge, helping steer Jesuit communities who are creating protocols for living in communities, a job that's not for the faint of heart. And I can say that as a fellow Jesuit. He's also a priest and is familiar with the kind of roles that presiders have at this liturgies, and I'll bring a bit of that insight into this discussion as well. And Johan von Parys, who is a native of Belgium, is the director of liturgy and sacred arts since 1995 at the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He holds graduate degrees in art history and comparative religious studies from the Catholic University in Louvain, Belgium, and a Ph.D. in theology from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. He has authored several books and articles in the field of liturgy and the arts and has taught at St. John's University in Collegeville and St. Thomas University in the Twin Cities. Johan has steered the Basilica's growth as a national leader in the liturgical practice for a parish that's located in a neighborhood of transition on the edge of the central business district of Minneapolis. So I welcome both of them, and I'll turn it over first for Michael just for some opening comments, and then we'll move to Johan. So Michael.
Thank you, Gilbert. It is good to join you all again and to continue this conversation. So just to kind of frame some of the conversation in terms of the public health knowledge, I think it's important to note that at the beginning of this pandemic, a lot was relatively unknown. We did not know exactly the pathophysiology of the disease, for whom it was more severe or not, was there effective treatment or not, how it was transmitted, how that transmission could be mitigated effectively, whether certain policies worked or not. So we had a pretty severe public shutdown across the country as we attempted to both minimize the hospitalizations and ensure our healthcare workers had the protective equipment and capacity that they needed to effectively treat those infected, but also to gain knowledge about this virus so that we could more effectively mitigate it moving forward. Those things that we have learned about the virus is that we know that the severity of disease has a gradient across age in particular, something that we're very familiar with, that elderly populations suffer severity of disease more frequently. We also know that males suffer it more frequently. We also know that people with certain underlying comorbid conditions, such as diabetes and congestive heart conditions, would suffer from greater disease. We also know, and one of the great items of hope of this disease is that we have gained a lot of knowledge in terms of effective mitigation of this virus. So we did not know early on the difference between inside and our indoor and outdoor transmission. We now know that the virus is much less likely to be transmitted when we are outdoors. We also, if you recall, early in the pandemic, did not know whether we should be wearing face masks. We now know that face masks, even for the civilian population, the non-medical community, are a very effective mitigating tool for spreading the virus. We have always encouraged hand washing and sanitizing of surfaces. We know that it's much less likely now to be transmitted via surface, much more likely via aerosol droplets expelled from individuals who are either pre-symptomatic or symptomatic. And that's the other piece that we now know much more clearly, that pre-symptomatic individuals, so people who are infectious, contagious with the disease, but have not yet displayed symptoms themselves, can very effectively transmit the virus to other people, which means that our mitigating strategies are not just about identifying those people who are symptomatic, but people who may have been exposed and are pre-symptomatic, and ensuring that they also take all the effective mitigations possible. And the final thing that I'd like to note from a public health perspective is that this virus is going to go through the typical cycles. Again, we didn't know questions early on, would summer and the heat be an effective mitigating strategy for this virus? Like, would it follow the normal flu trends of being more of a winter virus? We now know that that is not the case, that summer heat, as we see across the Gulf South and the Southwest United States, does not effectively mitigate the virus. So we need to be prepared for this to cycle back and forth throughout the calendar. And it's going to be more driven by community behaviors than by environmental factors like the weather, which requires us to prepare to change our strategies as community spread changes over time. So those are just a couple of the kind of prefatory remarks. I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll turn it over for Johan for some introductory comments. And just one note, if you do have a question, feel free to use the comment section on Facebook to send us those questions. Those will be routed then to Robert Hurto, our host, and then to me, and we'll move through those questions as they come in. So Johan.
Thanks so much, Gilbert. I'm glad to be here with you again this week. And since we met last week, I've been pondering what we have been doing since this all started. And I remember that when we started off, we really tackled this with some vigor. We wanted to do this all right. And how long could it possibly last? Maybe we thought maybe 2 weeks, 2 months, and here we are 5 months and looking at who knows how many more months. And I came to realize that, like most everyone, I think we're suffering from a bit of fatigue. And I longingly remember the time when we were able to greet one another as we make our way to church, and, simple nod, handshake or hug, or even a kiss and some friendly chatter, and all of that is gone. I would venture to think that, like most everyone, I longingly remember the church filled with our beloved community, rather than empty or filled with just a small number of our community members. I remember longingly our grand processions, our wonderful music, the words of God proclaimed by not just me, but by all of our lectors, singing by the assembly, unusually robust for a Catholic community. And I also look back longingly to gathering after the Masses with members of our community, having a cup of coffee and talking about how great the homily was or not, how good the choice of music was or not, what they liked and disliked about the liturgical decor. We talked about our lives, and together we truly rejoiced in being part of this very energetic faith community. And all of that seems to be lost, at least for now. You know, I miss all of this. And who knows, will it ever come back as it was? I think it's important that we acknowledge this loss that we have all experienced. We cannot just go on as if we did not experience this loss. And I would say, even in the dioceses where we have started to gradually reopen our churches for the celebration of the Eucharist, what we encounter is not what I just described, but rather a very highly sanitized version of what was once a very rich encounter that touched all the human senses. So the big question I ask myself is, how can we continue to be church under these circumstances? And as we experience things very differently from what we experienced, say, 5 months ago. And I'm particularly concerned about Sunday Eucharist. And we can say so many things about Sunday Eucharist, but I want to zero in on two elements of Sunday Eucharist. It is the place where we go for our spiritual nourishment. It's the place par excellence where we get our spiritual nourishment. And at the same time, during the celebration of the Eucharist, we build up the body of Christ. We build up the Christian community. So on the one hand, spiritual nourishment, and on the other hand, body of Christ, Christian community. And the question is, how can we handle this loss? How can we handle the loss of being deprived of the greatest gift, nourishment of our soul and our community? And I know we have tried, and we tried very, very hard to make up for this big loss. We have done things that 5 months ago I would have never said yes to, but we have, warmly embraced live streaming. I had no idea what live streaming was 6 months ago, and now I'm probably a pro at live streaming. And we have engaged new technology. Some of us use our iPhone, others use very highly sophisticated camera systems. So on the one hand, we have this 21st century technology, but on the other hand, I think we've also harkened back to our early days as Christians. We've looked at, what did early Christian communities do? What can we learn from what used to be known as the domestic church? So in an effort to continue to nourish the soul of our parishioners, we have embraced live stream. And many of us now have virtual liturgies. And in addition, I think we have tried to invite people to find other ways to be spiritually nourished. Cannot compare with the Eucharist, but there are other ways. Our Catholic tradition is very rich in terms of prayer, both individual prayer as well as domestic prayer with the household that we live in. And, maybe that is something we had lost, and this is an opportunity to rediscover personal prayer with our family at home. But we can also extend that through technology to broader groups. So in an effort to continue to create community, or at least to keep our community going, we have reached out to our members. So in addition to the live streaming, we do many other things. I mean, we have been focused mostly on the Eucharist, but the ministerial life of the parish needs to continue, not just the live streaming of the Mass, but all the other things we do as a parish. And so we have invited our members to continue to engage in all of these ministries, be they mostly virtual, and some of them in person, but with very strict safety protocols. Something I have noticed is that many of our parishioners have started to host watch parties so that they can actually participate in the liturgy with their friends virtually, as they would have done in reality. So they're of course not physically together, but they're virtually together. And then after the Mass is over with, they stay together and have a virtual coffee and donut hour. So people are really creative in terms of trying to keep that community going. Now I find that the Facebook live stream, for instance, has this option of commenting. And people have embraced those comments like you would not believe. And it's a great way of staying in touch with one another. You know, the little chatter that you would have had before Mass began when you were physically present, now it happens virtually through this comment section. Now, I have discovered that this electronic gift of commentary can indeed be a gift, but can also be a bit of a burden. So last Sunday, for instance, I had to ask our people to hold off on commenting during certain parts of the Mass. You know, like the consecration was just buried under all these comments. So a gift and a burden, and we have to learn how to use all of this. Now, there are a myriad of ways to stay connected with our fellow parishioners. You know, Bible studies, either virtual. I'm so wonderfully surprised how our Bible study groups have embraced virtual gatherings. Now, again, I have noticed that there is a little bit of a Zoom fatigue or a virtual getting together fatigue that is setting in, and people are trying to find ways to be together in person, but observing strict safety protocols. So, for instance, we have now Bible studies on the lawn that have crept up around here. Book clubs, the same thing. Centering prayer groups, the same thing. The RCIA is developing a virtual process. You know. So we talk about the process of RCIA, of becoming a new Christian. It's being developed in virtual ways now. We host early morning coffee and conversations, and we also host the occasional evening cocktails and conversations. So people really have used the 21st century technology to engage in all of these ministries, including our outreach ministries. What we have also discovered is people not only miss the liturgies, their fellow parishioners, the in-person ministries, but they miss being in the building. You know, when I Zoom with parishioners, they say, I so miss being in our basilica. And it is a very beautiful building. And, you know, when you're in that building in the morning, the light is so different from the afternoon, and there are all these little chapels and sacred art. And so we have tried to find ways to, now that people are not able to come to the building, for the building to go to the people. So we've created a number of initiatives. One of it is Art That Surrounds Us, where we do mini video vignettes that we send out to people in an attempt to try to continue to connect them with the building. So now, as I mentioned last week, there is no textbook that tells us exactly what to do. You know, as the medical field has continued to discover how this virus acts and how we can mitigate it, on the liturgy side, we have had to follow suit and develop things as we move forward. And it's so interesting because the situation keeps on changing and we have to keep on adapting. This time, if any, is a time to really think out of the box. And I think as long as we take health protocols seriously and do our very, very best to make sure that the souls of our parishioners are nourished and that our community stays connected, then I think we are doing the best we can. One last comment. Let's not make our desire for perfection get in the way of progress. I think that's enough for now.
Wonderful comments, Johan. A lot to ponder, which is great. Again, one of the things that we'll be discussing in different segments of this are different elements that you brought up, and especially that notion of not just the liturgical life, but those other ways that we have to feed and nourish people, whether it's faith formation or even children's ongoing programs, but the arts and all of these other realms. So what I'd like to do, we've got a few questions that have started coming in. The first one's going to be dealing with music, but that's actually one of our first topics that we'll be talking about. So I'm going to do a little recap of what we did last time. Again, hopefully to jar some memories for people who might have a question along those lines. And then we'll start going into the topics for this time. And we'll be starting again a little bit with more focus on the outdoor liturgies because of the conditions right now in California, where they're restricted from doing any liturgies inside. But most of those comments can jump towards the interior as well. And I'm going to ask the two panelists also, when the questions come up, feel free to actually bring those up. And the reason I say that is that it's hard for me to see when those come up because I've got the share screen on. Okay. So again, last week, we began looking at how people began to introduce returning to the liturgy. We looked through a video of the kind of common procedures and talked a little bit about best practices. Again, that first forum was recorded and is available on the website at the Loyola Marymount Center for Religion and Studies. And so Bob will give you further information towards the end along those lines. We talked a little bit about seating and about how to begin looking at that creatively. Just 1 second. We began looking at outdoors. How do we begin reimagining what liturgies would be occurring out there and how to begin looking at some seating, creative ways to infill the empty seatings. Some of the struggles, even with outdoor and indoor liturgies, with people keeping that social distancing of 6 feet, even with tape marks on the ground. And was there a distinction between outdoor and indoor liturgies because of the movement of air? And again, some of the struggles that people are having in maintaining a practice and developing a practice that's safe. We talked about sometimes the community that's now showing up are actually the ones that shouldn't be showing up because of age, but have the deepest desires to be in community, primarily because of the isolation. And so how do we continue to find ways to make everyone safe? We talked about some alternative communion distributions. This was in San Diego at the mission where they used these plexiglass shields as well as masks to help minimize the spread of the virus. We talked about taking communion out into the congregations rather than having procession and the impact that has also liturgically. We've talked about drive-in masses and looking at alternative outdoor liturgies that way. Again, a reminder, not all bishops are on board with this type of practice, but in those places that are, it might be worth exploring. We looked a little bit at drive-up communion and about virtual choirs and virtual lectors that are sometimes being used, and so that blend. So that's just a very fast recap of all the things that we talked about in the first forum. And again, hopefully that might jog some questions. What we'll be looking at today are two primary chunks. One is a follow-up on that outdoor directives, and specifically some issues of singing, procession and movement, and Eucharistic practice. And then this larger question of how is Christ present in the scattered community, maybe picking up on some of the themes that Johan mentioned about moving that liturgy and liturgical understanding a bit broader to how do we feed the community and how do we model maybe for the general public some of those issues. So I'm just going to bring up three directives that came up from, this is a diocese in California about outdoors. And the first had to do with music, and primarily saying that they should minimize, again, the use of any kind of music within a liturgical setting. And so I'm going to throw this out maybe first to Michael, just to talk about what's the current understanding within the world of public health regarding those issues of singing. And a specific question that came in last week was, how close can the cantor be to a congregation if they're using it? Some dioceses, again, has permitted the use of singing of mass parts. Others have absolutely no, allow no type of music in there.
Yeah, this is, as we talked about last week, that this is a very challenging discussion point, because I think we long so much for the music. So recognizing that very holy desire that we have to participate with each other in creating sacred music. It's really difficult to hear, I know, but the understanding is that singing indoors is very dangerous for transmitting the virus, and we really ought not be doing it, except, you know, maybe a single cantor for the indoor liturgies. And so congregational singing, just at this point, especially with the community spread that we have right now in most of our communities, I think the risk is just too high. And some people, might say, well, what if they sing softly? And so obviously, each step that you take is just kind of additional risk. That the thing that I see it as in terms of a challenge of even singing softly is that when we're moving our mouths in the way that singing requires, masks are more likely to slip on and off. And so even if we're not kind of expelling it as much as we would with loud singing, just the regular movement itself creates additional risk that then we would need to do further education with people on. And so it's not to say that there is a single way to do this correctly, but if we choose to do things, we need to be aware of any additional risk that accrues and how to educate people to minimize that appropriate risk. And so the general public health recommendation would be congregational singing indoors is just too dangerous at this point. In terms of the cantor and how far they would have to be, so there aren't any really great studies right now in terms of the distance of transmission that comes from kind of belting a song in the way a cantor would. I actually heard just this morning that there are studies, they're bringing in people to sing Happy Birthday over and over and over to get a sense of how far somebody can expel when singing loudly. But we don't have that yet. And so if it's 6 feet for regular conversation, it is going to be at least double or triple that whenever we are singing loudly. And so if you're a cantor, that's kind of what I would recommend. There is no like hard and fast rule on it, but the more distance you can put, the better off we are going to be.
And with the mask, that's helps, I suspect, but like you said, once the mask begins to slip and fall, then the transmission becomes an issue.
Exactly.
And so one of the comments that came in is, what is it when the cantor is singing on behalf of the congregation? And maybe this is a question for Johan, from a liturgical standpoint, I mean, there's that notion that, you know, singing is praying twice and all of that. And I've used some recorded music in our community liturgies, and I feel a struggle, because all of a sudden you could hear the guys trying to start singing, and it's like, stop, stop, don't do it, you know, you're going to kill us all, type of thing. But you know, I kind of wonder, what is that? What's the sense? I mean, I found myself singing silently inside. Is that the same? Is that?
Well, you know, I don't like you very much, Michael. What you have to say is really against what I believe in, but I, of course, have to work with what you have to say. So, you know, it's a very difficult issue, as you admitted yourself, Michael, but because it's everything is so counterintuitive, and it's against everything we have tried to do. You know, remember. Is this book about why Catholics don't sing, and you know, by comparison to other congregations, Catholics, you know, really don't sing very robustly, and we have tried over the years to encourage people to sing. So what we have trained them more or less to do, we have to untrain them to do. Now. Of course, when we talk about participation in the liturgy, full active unconscious participation, we often think about that we have to be doing everything ourselves. There are ways of participating which we don't necessarily have to do it ourselves. I always think back of when my father, I got a phone call that my father had passed away in Belgium. And I really didn't, the only thing I knew to do at that moment was to go to the noon mass, which happened to be a sung noon mass. And I couldn't sing because I would have started to cry. And so, but I was there, and I felt a deep connection with the community's prayer. So I knew I was participating, though I was not singing, though I was not speaking, but I was participating. So I believe there's different ways of participating fully, actively, and consciously. I think today we're called on the kind of participation which is more of an interior participation. Is it my preferred way? No. But is it the best way today? Yes. And as we need to adapt, you know, as I always say, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. These are extraordinary measures. Now, one of the difficulties I think we have is people who come to our liturgies are just so delighted that they can be back in church and participate physically in the liturgy. And I think for them, being told not to sing or is acceptable. When you're at home watching a live stream, participating in a live stream, if you have that sort of a very stripped down liturgical experience, I think it will be more difficult to keep people coming back. So can we find a balance? And that's what I hear people say too. They say, please don't take the music away from our live stream. So what we have opted to do starting this Sunday is we will have the live stream mass with more music, not, you know, a big choir, but just a few singers spread out throughout our vast space, which I hope, Michael, is okay. And then we will do another mass with people attending where there is absolute minimal singing. People will not have, you know, we'll do one verse for the opening hymn. People will not have the text. So that will be the minimal singing mass.
And Gilbert, I think singing, it crystallizes a genuine spiritual task that we have, and kind of building off of some of Johan's comments, and I think we as faith leaders, it's incumbent upon us to help people not to dwell on what isn't, but to kind of refocus our energies on what is. You know, we had several months where we couldn't even gather together within a church to pray and receive communion together. My goodness, we get to do that now. And so to kind of refocus people's energies into what is possible, what we're able to do, if we keep focusing in on, well, we can't do this, and we can't do this, and we can't do this, I just think it is the wrong approach to be taking, generally speaking. And I think it's incumbent upon us in particular as ministers in the church to help people focus their energies on the genuine gift we have, even if it's not as we have imagined it being in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because there are other ways to be introduced, I guess, in some respects, maybe to music that way. There was an interesting comment that came in that said, in their diocese, they're not allowed to do any music outdoors, but the suggestion was to use instrumental music of songs that people don't know well, so they won't sing. And I thought, actually, maybe that's not that bad. I mean, it might introduce people to other music, but several comments have come in, which was the music has always been a comfort for people, especially the familiar tunes, and that's where the struggle becomes. And so how do you allow both to feed each other? But maybe it's, again, thinking creatively about how some of those familiar tunes are just done as instrumental pieces, and then, you know, with a little variation. Johan?
Yep. Yeah, so we have two music directors, and we have a very talented organist, and then myself, and then we have cantors who are very well educated musically and also have strong thoughts. So it has been very interesting to figure out how to make this work. And when it comes to familiar melodies versus unfamiliar melodies, of course, there are arguments for both. Familiar melodies bring comfort, and people need comfort today. And but you know, if they know the words, they may be tempted to sing. Unfamiliar, you know, as you say, Gilbert, will allow us to introduce no melodies. It's still sacred sound, but people will not be tempted to sing along. So it will be, we will continue to struggle with this, but I think we need to keep in front of us this balance between health and liturgical nourishment. You know, we just cannot veer off from the health concerns.
Yeah, good point. One of the things that in the image that I had shown just recently, it showed just a single guitar player singing, and presumably that's the cantor as well. But I was watching our ordinations from the Western Province, and they used a guitar and a violin, which actually helped fill the sound a bit more. And I think maybe if we began thinking, especially for those outdoor liturgies where it's very difficult to get good instrumentation, but to think of ways of filling the sound so it doesn't feel so anemic would also maybe help people along those lines. So again, I think it's just creatively thinking through, or maybe it's about making noise. One of the parishes I was at is fairly poor parish, but at the Gloria, everyone would pull out their keys and start jingling their keys during the Gloria just to make noise, you know, and there was something about that, and they sang also, but that idea of making noise sometimes is maybe, you know, the prophetic utterance. If it's not being breathed out of your lungs, maybe there's just another way to think creatively of that too. I don't know if you guys have thought, for outdoor singing is also prohibited in many of the dioceses, but is that the same idea? Is that the projecting of the droplets are just, even with the mask on, are much more pressured, I guess, to come out that way?
Yeah. So, I mean, the, you know, as we think of kind of layers of risk, certainly being outdoors is one less level of risk if you are singing, but you still have the idea that you're likely positioned only 6 feet apart, and, you know, your mask might slip off and, you know, move down the other things that haven't changed. And the risk profile is very often just too great for that. Now, I mean, we discussed some kind of creative outdoor liturgies that would permit singing. So if you're spaced, like those people sitting in their cars, they can absolutely sing, and they could even sing with the windows open. There's no reason for them to, if you wanted to roll down your windows while sitting in your car, great. Or if you're in a field where it's much more spread out than 6 feet, then it might be safe to do so. But generally speaking, our outdoor setups don't mitigate it enough to allow for singing.
Good. Again, if people do have questions, feel free to keep bringing them into the comment section. I'm going to shift to the next area that came up in this topic area, which was the sign of peace, which I find is an interesting thing. Many dioceses have now just restricted that liturgical element. Others have figured out kind of creative ways to share a sign of peace, whether it's a peace sign or kind of like the Asian Indian namaste, bowing, and other things. And maybe this is a liturgical question first for you, Johan, if there's a way or anything creative that you've come across that you think has worked that way.
So, there are different ways of dealing with this health crisis. One is to get rid of as much as possible altogether. Another way is to look at everything we have and to ask a more difficult question: how can we keep doing this in a safe way? When it comes to the sign of peace, the easy thing to do is to say, we're not having it. But this is a very important moment and an important aspect of the trajectory of the liturgy. As before we approach the altar of the Lord, we reconcile, we share peace with one another. And so it's not window dressing, it's an essential part of the liturgy. So I find it more productive to figure out if there are ways to share the peace in a new non-touch way. But of course, if you attend Mass with your household, there are no restrictions there. You can still exchange a physical sign of peace. So I would advocate to find ways, even if it's a friendly nod or a little bow. So that's what most of the people I notice here doing is they just bow at one another.
Gotcha.
And I would do a hearty support. This is one of the areas where public health doesn't have to be the mean and no person. So yes, creative solutions. Let's find them. It is possible.
Now, one of the ones that came up here at the university was people like to do elbow bumps. Yeah, this might be a health issue. Now, at 6 feet, it's very difficult to do that, so that helps.
Yeah.
But I've seen this happening at other places. Now, should that be avoided from a public health standpoint? Is the elbow bump a acceptable way of tactile engagement, I guess, for lack of a better word?
Well, I mean, it's just, I would consider it an unnecessary risk. Okay. It's really nearly impossible to maintain the distance that we're trying to maintain in the worship space, and encouraging people to get, within an elbow's touch of each other. So there might be other situations in our lives where that elbow bump is really appropriate, but within the context of liturgy, I just don't see it as really kind of either liturgically all that beneficial enough to justify the risk.
Right. There was a comment that you made. Johan?
So to me, it has this sign of peace has become sort of emblematic of the fact that we all have to refrain from physical interaction. Now, being from Belgium, European, we are not shy of hugging and kissing one another, and it's a bit of a shock to our system not being able to do that, and to find somehow alternatives to this, I think is very helpful. And as I said, the sign of peace is a bit of an emblematic of this whole much broader experience of the absence of physical contact.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, it's interesting. I think it was Michael had mentioned in the last one, there's you know, you want to try to give people a sense of predictability, I guess, within a liturgical setting so that they're not constantly having to renegotiate what's going on. And I think this is one of those areas where I've noticed at a university liturgy sometimes where as soon as people do the fist bump, all of a sudden 6 feet is not 6 feet anymore. And when communion comes up, all of a sudden they're kind of going down to 3 feet or 2 feet, you know, and it really is hard to re-engage that without being, you know, liturgical police, you know, stopping people and saying you got to back up or something, which is hard. But one thing that I'll note, as an Asian Indian, we've been doing this kind of practice of almost like a namaste. And I have to admit, I grew up in Orange County, so I'm not much of an Asian Indian understanding. I only learned namaste when I did trick-or-treating as a kid, and I would do that and I would get extra candy because the people always thought it was so cute. But the problem is I realized that gesture only works when you're greeting one other person, but when you're greeting other people, it really changes that. So all of a sudden, this gesture that means I recognize the divine in you can't be done like a rapid fire machine gun. It has to be done very differently. So I think that gesture, at least for me now, doesn't seem to be working. So I'm trying to find my own, whether it's a peace sign or something else. Somebody would do this kind of almost like they were blowing kisses to people. And I guess we just have to stay creative until we can figure out what that is. One of the comments that came in was saying that the deacon always just announces, please share the sign of peace by word or gesture, and then does a little wave. So it gives people an idea of some kind of a gesture that doesn't seem insulting to the others. So that could be another creative thing that a lot of committees begin thinking about. I'm going to shift to the next one, which is this idea of the placement of the elements on the altar table. So in, just one second, maybe I don't think I did this quite right. And the question had to be, the question was, especially the elements for the presider can be within close proximity to the presider, but the elements for the congregation should be spread apart. We've always, at our community liturgies, moved them to the side, so it's basically outside of his spit region or projectile region, or whatever you want to call that. But there's been different directives from different dioceses about should those elements for the community be covered with a pall or with a piece of linen, or should they not even be on the table but on an adjacent table next to it? So I'll kind of throw that back out, both from a liturgical standpoint and then from a public health.
Well, from a liturgical standpoint, I think we have to probably veer away again from what is the intuitive thing to do. But as you mentioned, different dioceses have different prescriptions. When it comes to wearing a mask, some dioceses prescribe that the priest is to wear the mask throughout the entirety of the liturgy, and some dioceses say they ought not to wear a mask at all, except for the distribution of Holy Communion. And the other day I was watching a live stream mass, and at the doxology, at the end of the Eucharistic prayer, the priest elevated the sacred species and sang con gusto the doxology. And I imagined, no, there's no covering, there was no mask. And I thought, well, all the other things we have been doing to keep people safe are for naught, because there it is. Right. I am in a number of liturgical forums that we discuss these things. And so the one suggestion that has been brought up, which would be, in normal circumstances, we would not recommend this, but is to have the priest consecrate just a host for the priest, and then have communion from the tabernacle for the people assembled. So we, for one, have lots of hosts in the tabernacle because we haven't had masses with people present for months. So we have to, I think in this instance, liturgical protocol would predict one thing, which is no mask, no covering, no separation of the host from the priest and the assembly. But I think what Michael would support is, and what I would support too, is these extraordinary measures for the time being to ensure health. And so covering the species, having them separate, but many of our altars are not big enough to have the hosts for the assembly far enough from the priest to be safe. So more questions probably than answers here. Michael?
Yeah, I think there are several ways this can be done safely. I think not the only, I'll never say only, the unsafe way to do it is for the priest to have his face uncovered and to have the elements within range of his speaking. So on the altar within 6 feet of him. That is a clearly unsafe way to do this and really ought not be done. So Johan has given a couple ways to do it safely. Gilbert, you said some others. In our Jesuit community, we keep it on the altar. We cover it with a linen, and so the priest is the only one who receives the blood and receives the host that he consecrated on the paten right in front of him uncovered, and everybody else receives from a covered paten, which is safe, or you can put it off to the side, you can get it from the tabernacle, but clearly uncovered face and elements within range is unsafe. And for me, I think it gets into kind of a larger way of modeling that I think we should be about. So the priest really ought not be an exception to the rule in terms of what we ask of the congregation, in the same way that I think our worshiping community ought not be an exception to the rule of what we're asking of the broader city or town. So like the more that we can not claim to constantly be exceptions, that we can model behavior for people within our community, I think that is good for the church as a whole. And the priest, I think, can do that well during the consecration.
Okay. There was a question that came up earlier, and it had to do with intincture, which I've always been told is actually the most dangerous way of doing communion, because your fingertips could potentially touch the wine, and then you're constantly contaminating. I don't know. I think now most places have gotten rid of it, but I know some dioceses early on said intincture was the way to do this. But am I wrong in that, Michael or Johan? I mean, I've always just been told that that's the worst. But and this had to do with ordinations early on, but I think other parishes were taking the practice up.
Yeah. So I think there might be some circumstances in which it is possible to do that well. It really ought not be a situation where multiple unsanitized fingers are dipping into a chalice. That is a very dangerous situation to be in. And so I noticed in the comments somebody says, "What about an uncovered face with a linen-covered ciborium?" And yes, I think that's entirely safe.
Good. And Johan?
And it reminds me, Michael, of you made a comment last week that kind of took me by surprise, is that when you sanitize your hands with one of those sanitizers, the common thought is that it takes immediate effect, but apparently it does not.
It does not. Yeah. Yes, and it's another thing that people don't like to hear because it really messes with the way that we have imagined we can do things, which is why, again, this is going to throw people for somersaults, but the idea of people communicating and then immediately sanitizing their hands in between multiple communications, that's better than nothing. But in reality, there should be several minutes that that take place before you do the next communication.
And it's usually 20 seconds of constant rubbing, right, for the hand
Agitation,
sanitizer to actually be effective. And then even then you were saying that that's not enough, that you have to give it another couple minutes or so?
Exactly.
Yeah. And there was a suggestion, I think, that came in the comments. Can you sanitize your hand at the back end of the communion line, so by the time you got there, you were sanitized? And that seems like it's a plausible way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know as a presider, what I find odd sometimes is, we're sanitizing our hands, and then we're doing the lavabo, which is the washing of the hands, and then we're re-sanitizing our hands again. And so there's like this multiple layer, and it just seems comical at times, even for Jesuits, who are not always the most liturgically correct group, but it just seems bizarre doing this. I don't know if Johan, in thinking of this liturgically, if there's been a good way to resolve that. I mean, the action of washing your hands is always meant to be, it's ceremonial as well as practical, but I mean, there's that sense of washing away the iniquities. Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, the act of the washing of the hands was a requirement of, after having received all the gifts, before continuing with Eucharistic prayer. And by gifts, it could be fruits of the field, sheep, all these gifts. And so there was a necessity to washing the hands, which then, of course, has been given a symbolic meaning. But, it's a little bit ironic that we have gotten back to this physical need for washing the hands. And so traditionally we have had the lavabo, a beautiful pattern and a pitcher and a beautiful linen towel. But can this be changed? I mean, to me, sanitizing your hands in order to wash your hands, in order to sanitize your hands, it's the number 3, so there's some sacredness to the number 3, but nevertheless, it seems overdone. I was actually watching one of our priests, at the lavabo. He was just sanitizing his hands with a sanitizer. And I thought, isn't it interesting that this epidemic has reimagined the lavabo? It's still, in a sense, the lavabo. We're still doing the action. We're still saying the prayer. It's a different way of doing it. Will it stick? I don't know. I have thought that people will invent new liturgical accoutrement that is not just a plastic bottle, but some sort of a silver bottle that you use. So I'll take a patent
design
on
that. The design mind in me is going wild with this.
and coming to your Catholic supply store for, I'm sure, a very reasonable price.
Yes, exactly. We did have one question that came in from a comment, and it was they're watching the Mass virtually, and they have a piece of bread in front of them, and obviously it's not the same as receiving the Eucharist, and this might be a landmine type of question to ask, but is that kind of gesturing at these virtual Masses at home something that might help a community? Or I can't imagine that it hurts unless one presumes that this is in fact, that the body of Christ is now in this piece of sourdough bread that's before me. But that ritual action seems interesting. So just any comments that way?
So I think this can be seen in the broader context of how we can make the participation from the domestic church in the church service more real. One of the things we did for Holy Week is take every liturgy of Holy Week and look at all the liturgical actions that we have in Holy Week. Washing of the feet, lighting of candles, sprinkling with holy water. And then we recreated that for the domestic church. So before every service, we invited people to set up their chapel with all the symbols that would be used during the liturgy. And then at the appropriate time during the liturgy, as we were, say, washing feet, which only one couple, a married couple, symbolically did it for all of us. But, you know, people at home were invited to wash one another's feet. So I think there is a great way of making those symbols that are in the church tangibly present in the domestic church. When it comes to the Eucharist, of course, there we tread on very dangerous ground. Personally, I would say having a bread and a cup of wine present it probably would enhance the experience, as long as it is very clear that that remains just bread and just wine. You know, the consecration by the priest will not turn the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. So I'm all for trying to engage in all the symbolic actions at home, as long as we don't create these pitfalls of, you know, we don't want to enter into heretical territory, if that makes sense.
Right, right. And I think that's the critical thing is as we begin to adapt a couple of newer procedures, and again, this is temporary, but could be lingering for a while, which are the ones that are kind of potentially dangerous in some respects too, for a Catholic imagination from not capturing the sense of understanding of real presence and what that means.
I am reminded, though, of work we do with our children in terms of preparation for the first time they receive Holy Communion. Is, you know, we talk about the dining experience. We talk about the meaning, the importance of bread in our daily life. We may bake a bread, and so these connections are made from the Eucharistic table and the domestic table. But again, I think some careful catechesis is important if we do that.
Okay, good. We did get another question, just a quick return back to music. And I think people are obviously struggling with this. And I think Michael hit the nail on the head. It was like, this is that part that's from the guts, you know, not being able to do this. But whether recorded or live instrumental is better for a liturgical perspective. Live is better than recorded. These are kinds of questions, but and I think this also fed back to an earlier question in smaller rural parishes where they have limited ability for some of the technological uses of materials. You know, have you come across some ways of doing this? And there was a previous question too, not to lump them all together, but these virtual choir softwares, you know, are they fairly easy to use? I know the Basilica had, I think the choir did a piece from a piece that was going to be sung, I think, in Europe on tour at one point, and the choir just decided to do it. And they did a great job with it, but do you know, Johan, was that technically difficult to do, or was that something that...
Well, it's when you have a choir of, the fewer people who are singing, the less complicated it is. The more people you add, the more complicated it gets. It's surely doable, and you know, as they do at St. Monica and Santa Monica, it's a wonderful way of engaging the liturgical ministers. I mean, one of the aspects we have not discussed really is the mourning our liturgical ministers do because of the fact that they are unable to exercise their ministries. You know, the musician, we have several choirs, and I hear it over and over again. We want to come back and we want to sing. You know, Eucharistic ministers, the people who proclaim, the lectors, you know, we want to proclaim the word. And of course, again, at St. Monica, they have the lectors proclaiming from their home, which is then spliced into the live stream experience. So I think one has to do a balancing act of figuring out which is more important, the in-person proclamation of the word during the liturgy as, to preserve the integrity, the engagement of liturgical ministers through technological usage. This will be different for every parish. I don't think there is a unanimous answer or an answer that we can give for everybody here. Although the liturgy for the Roman Catholic Church is the same everywhere, it is interpreted and celebrated very much relative to the sensitivities of the local communities. And so I think in this situation that we're in today, we differ, and we all need to figure out how we can do best what we're called to do. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
I think it is. And again, it's one of these ones I think we have to keep kind of thinking creatively about how to engage. And we'll come back to this idea of how to keep our liturgical ministers alive, because of these great desires. How do we think creatively of how people minister within the church along those lines? I hate to take us from the kind of the more heady and surreal to the mundane, but outhouses came up as one of the topics. And so I want to just bring this up. Just 1 second. Let me try to get. So these were things that were recommended or not recommended. And one was the use of outhouses because of the outdoor restrictions now in Southern California. And diocese recommended using them. And as a designer, I thought to myself, I'm afraid to use them on a good day, let alone in the midst of a pandemic. But I don't know if there's been any studies, Michael, about using outhouses versus, I know normally restrooms are designed with hard surfaces that are easy to clean. And because of that, they tend to be preferred, but I haven't seen anything. I think our intuitions are probably pretty accurate here that, they are safe insofar as they are cleaned after every usage. And the likelihood of all of the surfaces, the door handles that you're grabbing and everything being cleaned after every usage, if that's what's possible, great. But I would not recommend, just like an indoor restroom, I'm sure that these are being recommended so that people don't go inside the church to use the restrooms there. But either way, they should be cleaned as after each usage. Okay. And in the standpoint, if they have easy access to restrooms within their facilities, would that be the preferred versus using an outhouse? Or I just don't know how much ventilation these things typically have. When I've used them, they haven't been a lot. Yeah.
I would think each space is going to be very different. The ability to clean things regularly is going to be very different. And so I honestly, the person who is most able to answer this is probably the facilities manager at your particular parish, and trust his or her instinct in terms of which one can be kept sanitized most easily.
Gotcha. And the other one that came up that I thought was interesting were these cooling misters and the use of that. And from a public health standpoint, is there any? I know earlier you mentioned that potentially problematic if people start to group in them, right? And that they're not keeping that 6 foot social distancing.
Absolutely. So again, it's a balance that if you are having people, if you're doing outdoor liturgies and they're suffering from some kind of heat stroke, yes, you definitely want to have resources available to take care of them. But insofar as this becomes a secondary gathering place where it's difficult to kind of you don't want to be the misting station police, just like you don't want to be the liturgy police. And so you don't want to set up the kind of structures that make people's decisions more difficult. And to me, like if if heat stroke or something were a risk, A, the person should probably be recommended to stay away from that particular event. Or B, you might want to have individual bottles that you give to people. And so rather than investing in this huge misting station, why not just have small spray bottles that are available to be used by individuals to keep themselves cool? I think it's cheaper and likely safer.
Gotcha. Good. And along those lines, they were just talking about the preparation of an outdoor area for liturgy. And I was thinking, Johan, there's been a lot of times the church uses the exterior for great processions, whether it's the lighting of the Easter candle or Palm Sunday or Eucharistic adoration. And just if there were any thoughts that you might have as towards what makes for a good setting. And also this festive notion, and this might be where the misting tent comes in. I mean, there are processions and movements, though, again, I think in this pandemic world, the idea is not to have movement or processions, but are there any, from your own experience of just doing outdoor liturgies at times, that you find helpful?
Well, of course, all of the outdoor experience we have here is pre-pandemic, which, you know, when you have 1,500 or 2,000 people on the plaza in front of the basilica, you can do that when there's no pandemic. But, you know, today one cannot do any of those. And we really don't have the space to do outdoor liturgies. So we are constrained by indoor liturgies, which makes it impossible to have any meaningful processions. You know, the ones you've experienced, Gilbert, are all suspended for the time being. The most we have, which is so unprocession-like, is the shortest route from the sacristy to the sanctuary, which of course is not a procession because processions are not functional. But so that's the only thing we can do right now. When it comes to celebrating liturgy outdoors, I know we have numerous restrictions, but I think we have to try and to create some sense of the sacred. And, you know, this can be done with banners or with flowers or plants or however one can do it safely. I think it's important that we don't just plop a priest in front of, you know, people on a chair, because this is still the celebration of the Eucharist. You know, it's still our most sacred action we undertake. And so we need to be able to create a space that will support the sacredness of the celebration of the Eucharist. I would say that should be the basic guiding principle for any outdoor celebration of the Eucharist. We talked a little bit about distribution last week with, you know, that umbrella that was used or not used, you know, and how this is not just a functional thing, protecting the Blessed Sacrament from the rain, but it's an honorific action as well, creating this sacred space. You know, we really have to go the extra mile. When we celebrate Eucharist in the church, it's all there for us already. When we do it outside, it's not. And so it asks more of us.
I think the one thing I would just add as an architectural designer is to let the building help you in creating the backdrop for the space, because the frame view that you create will allow it, and also the building can provide shade and stuff, which would be helpful, so you don't have to invest in a lot of these misting stations and other things too. So use your whole facility that way and just think creatively. The one thing I like about
Easter, on Easter Sunday, at the end of the liturgy, the Archbishop went outside with the Blessed Sacrament and blessed the city from the portico of the basilica. And so you're mentioning of using the building, you know, we used the facade, and it was a magnificent experience. So yeah.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I think any of those things. The one comment I'd make also, just in this picture in the on the screen right now, just that bunting along the bottom of the platform kind of says we're taking a little extra care to make this special. And I think any little things like that is helpful, just to really set the altar platform special, so that it has that uniqueness to it. Again, these were some of the different kinds of things that started popping up early on. Oops, I just need to switch this back. Not sure why it's not letting me.
You're doing that, Gilbert, just want to answer directly a question. Is there any evidence that anyone has contracted COVID by ingesting food? I have not seen any evidence of that. That does not mean that it is not possible. This is probably linked to our conversation around the elements and potential droplets dropping on the food. So at the same time, while there might be not much evidence of it, our restaurants and places of dining have been very good about people wearing masks. I would not personally eat at a restaurant where my server was not wearing a mask, or the people who were preparing the food were not wearing masks, just because it would be an unnecessary risk.
Gotcha. Good. I'm not sure why I'm,
Michael,
sorry, I'm not able to.
Michael, there was an earlier question about the use of incense. Now, I have my liturgical thoughts on it, but is there a health concern with incense in addition to it being smoke?
No, I would say as long as there aren't multiple people touching the thurible, there would be very little risk associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have heard people concerned that it causes coughing in a lot of people, which then obviously would be a bit more problematic, but they are spread out. And I suppose when they go into the church, they could ask for a seat further away from an aisle where they would encounter it like they normally would in doing that. I'm going to do one last thing before we start to wrap this up. And that was to look at this question about how we might learn from other sources, and specifically baseball. Right now, we've got this issue about using these cutouts, and baseball players right now are struggling, just as I think parishioners are struggling, because they're in these kind of empty or semi-empty churches. And I don't know, has there been any insights? Maybe this is more for Johan, but have there been some creative things that you've come across that you think is useful from what you've seen in other arenas? Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they have those supporters in the baseball stadium cutouts, we've seen that in churches as well. Certain pastors, particularly when we were not allowed to have anybody in church, they made cutouts of parishioners and put them throughout the church, which I thought was a great attempt at making connection with the people who are at home and the few people who are in the church celebrating. I could recognize myself. Oh, I am sitting in the pew, though I'm at home.
Right.
So now that we are at the point where we're starting to gradually reopen, I think that there is the reality of the absence of community. Mm-hmm. And to me, to see just a few people in the pews and all these empty spots is an affirmation that it's not yet what it was or what it hopefully will be again. We are still missing all these people who are not sitting in the pews. So it's, there is a certain honesty that we need to embrace while going through this pandemic. And I think the part of the honesty is the aspect of the absence of community, which hopefully will make us our desire for community not diminish, but increase as we move on. Here's some of my thoughts.
I was thinking, when I do a funeral liturgy, there's always that kind of slow procession from the back of the church, and usually churches are semi-empty because they're not large congregations, but there is that sense of grief, right? Because it almost amplifies the fact that this person is gone and the community is diminished because of that. And I keep thinking, I wonder if there are these other liturgical moments that we have already in our settings that maybe will help us think about that notion, because it is very startling when you walk into a church that's, mostly empty and there's just a few people there, that sense of diminishment. Yeah.
And and I think there's also the challenge for the celebrant, and if there is elected, the lector, to make the connection with the people at home. If the person who is at home has the experience that they are, when the gospel is proclaimed, the priest is proclaiming it to me. He's preaching to me, not preaching to an empty church, but actually preaching to me in my home. I think it makes a great difference.
And Gilbert, I haven't really thought through this, how it would work in the liturgy, but it makes me think whenever, I am presiding at a baptism, I will often ask for the names of people who aren't present and include those names, the saint name in the litany of the saints that we do. And just to kind of tell them that we are invoking the saint names of the people and their family and friends who couldn't be there, to kind of give them this emotional, spiritual connection to people who aren't there. So I wonder if there's a couple things like that could be creatively added that evoke this larger communion of which we're a part.
Yeah. I noticed when I noticed when we were doing our live streaming of our community mass, people at the beginning of the mass would sign in, kind of thing. They would kind of identify who they are and where they're from. And we're going to try that we're going to do a virtual hybrid high-flex model of a St. Ignatius Day feast mass on this Friday, where we're going to be using virtual and in person in our chapel. But we're hoping we'll be able to show the list of people that aren't in the chapel who have joined us. And that's might be another way for parishes to start thinking of how they connect those people who aren't there. One of the things that we had talked about earlier, and we're starting to come towards the end, so we probably won't be able to do much on this, but to look at what are the other ways from a technological standpoint. And this was one of the questions that came up about using, let's say, the Liturgy of the Hours or Taizé services or other kinds of ways to enhance, let's say, a weekly offering for a congregation.
So yes, I think there's a great opportunity, and the Second Vatican Council envisioned that Liturgy of the Hours was going to become the prayer of the parish. We're not there at all, but maybe this is an opportunity. And so we do live stream Sunday Vespers. We live stream Taizé service. We have morning prayer, like tomorrow morning. We have morning prayer. Right now we use Zoom to do morning prayer. It's not the best solution. We'll probably go to using our cameras in church, but people are at their homes because we do a morning prayer with our parish staff, but everybody works from home. So the way to connect is through Zoom, and so we have Zoom morning prayer. So there's many different ways to engage in the rich traditions of our Catholic prayer life through technology.
And in some ways, I can see almost now social media ministry occurring in parishes, where they're using maybe some of the younger community members thinking creatively about how to do podcasts or interviews or other faith formation work. There's a lot of creativity out there that I think parishes can do it. And I've started to see that, which is really refreshing. It's exciting to see. I think you guys at the Basilica have started a section on art in the Basilica, which one of the things that it does for me is it reminds me there's a physical space that I'm longing for. And I was mentioning these at lunch at the Jesuit community, and one of the pastors was saying, I'm starting to look at my church now very differently. All of a sudden, the stained glass windows look very different when I'm presiding in this COVID situation, and to understand some of the richness that those buildings have and use that as a moment of education so people will long to come back to the building. Because I do worry that sometimes the virtual world makes it easier to come to Mass in your pajamas and just kind of sit there and engage and feel, and what is it going to be? But these sacred spaces are much more rich of language that I think we should be looking for. Any closing comments before I turn it back to Robert? We do have, for those of you watching, a video that you probably have seen already in social media that is well worth it, using a song from Hamilton to talk about coming back to liturgy. But before we go there, and unless there's from the panelists any specific ones, this is again our final session for this forum. There's going to be an evaluation form that will be launched for those online to comment on this, and then that'll allow the Center for Religion and Spirituality at Loyola Marymount to consider other forums or other ways of expanding this if it's helpful for your organization. So any comments from the panelists?
I would just say very briefly, kind of, I referenced the idea of our faith communities being models for the cities in which we are located. And I think that's particularly important, that we don't keep trying to claim exceptions, and that we model a sense of solidarity, that we model a sense of the common good, that we model a sense of caring for the most vulnerable among us and loving thy neighbor through our actions. Because the more that we can be that kind of visible presence of living this thing well, it's very similar to kind of early pandemics or epidemics in early Christianity. It was the rich who fled into the countryside, and it was the Christians who stayed back to actually care for the sick. And it was that model of behavior that attracted a lot of believers early in the Christian tradition. And so we don't want to be those people who think that we ought to be able to flee to the countryside to be to escape the reality of this particular moment.
Yeah, and the media picks up on those churches that do go out there and counter everything, which is really frustrating. Yeah. Johan, any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking of Matthew 25. What you did to the least of mine, you do unto me. And in all times, we are called, as Michael says, to set an example. And I think above all today, we are called to set an example and to work for the well-being of the cities to which we have been sent.
Wonderful. With that, I would just like to thank both of you for taking the time to help us through this, because it's a difficult situation that almost every parish is facing, is how to think through very delicate decisions on these matters. So thank you for helping enrich the church here in the United States and further on these issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Robert.
Thank you, Father Gilbert. And hold on one sec. Yes. Just get set up here really quickly. Yeah, I too want to echo my thanks and gratitude to our two panelists, Father Michael Rozier and Dr. Johan von Parys, along with our moderator, Father Gilbert Sunghera. They have volunteered their time to make this forum available, and we here at LMU are very grateful for your spirit of service and collaboration to the Church's mission during this difficult, but just kind of thinking of Michael's last remark, also a hopeful time in which we're called to solidarity. We all know these months of pandemic have been a time of uncertainty, and that's certainly true for people who have responsibility in the liturgy. We hope that these forums have mitigated the uncertainty a little bit by providing up-to-date information on public health risks in relation to Catholic liturgical practice. On our Facebook page, you will find a link to the evaluation of the forums. It's being posted in the comment section as I speak, and it should also be appearing on the post. If you have participated or viewed these forums, please click on that link to take just 2 minutes to complete the evaluation. We are very interested in your feedback. It really helps us to develop and improve our offerings. And we're especially, as Father Gilbert noted, we're interested to understand if there's particular interest in this line of this type of forum, again, of a public health expert with a liturgist and looking at our practice of liturgy during the pandemic. Thank you all for your participation. I turn it back over to Gilbert. I think he has something for us at the end.
We found a great video that we would like to just share with you at this time. And as you do your evaluations, we hope this at least provides a little comic relief for what you're dealing with. So have a wonderful remainder of the summer, and blessings on your work to engage the church community.